you get the benefit of what's called the business judgment rule. And basically what the Delaware courts have said, that if you do the right thing, duty of disclosure, duty of good faith, duty of care, duty of loyalty, you do these in good faith, that we will never second guess you. You can make the stupidest decision, Mr. Director, but we will not second guess you. Okay? That the business judgment rule is like a cloak, like Superman's cloak, that you put around you to protect you. And a lot of people will wonder why. Why do directors have such broad protection under the law? Why aren't they held accountable for their decisions? And the reason is that the courts have held that it's important that really good, experienced, successful people serve on boards. And nobody would want to serve on the board if they thought they could be second-guessed. So they're willing to give up some of this accountability to provide protection so that we have good board members. So that's really the business judgment rule. Okay? And again, let me give you an example, because I really want you to understand. A lot of people say to me, well, you know, you're on the board of the companies. How do you protect yourself from liability? What do you do? Well, first of all, you have to have D&O insurance, because even though you may never have to pay anything, you will get sued. And directors and officers insurance will provide for protection for lawsuits. So if you're going to think about joining a board, make sure they have adequate insurance. Have a lawyer check and make sure the insurance is adequate, because you want that legal protection, because you can end up incurring tens and thousands of dollars or more of legal fees protecting, in essence, what defending yourself in essence, what are in many times frivolous suits. So you need to have insurance, but you have to do something really bad. And the example would be, let's say you were a director of Citibank, and you were a good director of Citibank, but you weren't a financial expert. And what happened was, you're studying the financial statements, and you notice two things. One is Citibank has a lot more leverage than it ever did before, that it has a lot more debt on its book than it ever did before. And it's taking that money that it's gotten and it's investing in these assets you don't really understand, these things called derivatives. So you go after a board meeting, you go to Chuck Prince and say, Chuck, I don't understand. I don't understand why we have so much more leverage on our books, why we have so much debt. And I don't understand these assets we're investing in. He says, don't worry about it. Don't worry about a thing. We have all this leverage because everybody else does. WAMU does, and Wachovia does, and all of our competitors do. And if we don't lever up our business, our earnings would lag behind our competitors. Our share price would suffer, and you certainly don't want that. So, but let me tell you about this other question, these things called derivatives. We have the smartest guys in the world. We have MIT PhDs, and all they do all day is spend their time tracking and understanding this stuff. So what I'll do, I'll tell you what I'll do. At the next board meeting, I'll have these guys come in, and they'll make a presentation. And they'll tell you about derivatives and what they do. So sure enough, at the next meeting, these 5 guys walk in, and they all got their laptops, and they've all got all these models. And Warren Buffett always says, beware of geeks bearing spreadsheets. But you sit down, and they start to pull up all these PowerPoints. And they have a sales guy making the presentation, because these guys are real good with numbers, but they're not the best at communicating. But they're doing their numbers. And by the 3rd slide, you're completely lost. You have no idea what's going on. But you look around the room, and there's Robert Rubin and all these other smart people, and they all seem to be engaged. So they go through this presentation. It takes about 15, 20 minutes. At the end, you know, Chuck Prince says, thank you very much. He turns to you and the other members of the board and says, do you have any other questions? And you either have 1,500 questions or none, because you don't have no idea what they were talking about. But you don't say anything, and they walk out of the room. And the question is, did you satisfy your obligation as a director by doing that? Now, let me give you another example. Let's say you're on the board of Merck or Johnson & Johnson or one of the major pharmaceutical companies, and you're on that board because you are a financial expert. And you walk into a board meeting one day, and the chairman says, I have some really good news. We've cured cancer. We've created a drug that will shrink all types of tumors with no second hands, and we've cured cancer. Now, you're thinking, gee, how do I get out of here and make a phone call to my broker, which you know you can't do. That would be illegal. But you're also, are you responsible for understanding the chemical interaction that causes these tumors to shrink? Well, most people would say no. Directors don't need, we don't need, every director shouldn't be a scientist. And because you're on the board, you need to know it went through the FDA testing and that it was, all the things were done that were proper. But you don't really understand the chemistry. In the same way, the courts have held that the directors of Citibank needed to understand that there was a system in place and there was supervision and there were procedures, but they didn't necessarily need to understand exactly how these derivatives worked. So it's a very broad protection. Now, what a good director at Citibank, in hindsight, again, what a good director at Citibank might have said was, your models of future performance are based on certain assumptions. What are some of those assumptions? And if they go through and they say, well, one of the assumptions is housing prices will always rise, you might say, well, what happens if they don't? Say, don't worry about it. Housing prices will always rise. We have no problem. I said, yeah, but, you know, humor me. What if they didn't? What if housing prices fell by 5%? Somebody sits there and they press all the buttons and says, can't be right. They do it again. I don't know. Got an extra look at it. He says, you know what would happen if housing prices fell? All these assets would be worthless and the bank would be bankrupt. Really? Well, what's the chance of that happening? But it'll never happen. So what's the chance of it happening? Is it 1 in a million? Well, yeah. Is it 1 in 1,000? Well, it's not 1. Is it 1 in 100? No, it's not 1 in 100. Well, and then you turn to the other board members and say, are we willing to take that risk? Are we willing to bet our institution that housing prices will always rise? And at least they would have had that discussion. But there's no indication that that discussion ever occurred in any of the boardrooms of any of our companies. So again, but I really want you to understand this duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of disclosure, good faith, and the business judgment rule, because it's paramount to responsibility of directors.